There was a moment in the 1980s when movies didn't need to be illegal to feel dangerous. They weren't hidden, they weren't banned, they weren't even labeled as adult in any clear way. And yet, people watched them differently. These were films that slipped into living rooms and late night television, carrying a kind of intimacy that felt out of place. Too slow, too personal, too focused on desire to be watched without hesitation. They didn't shock audiences, they made them uncomfortable in a quieter way. This video isn't about explicit cinema or exploitation or pushing limits for attention. It's about a specific kind of tension the 80s accidentally created. Movies people wanted to see, but never wanted to be seen watching. So let's step back into that decade and revisit the films that taught an entire generation how to watch in secret. Number 7, 9.5 Weeks, 1986. When we watched a film like this in the 1980s, we didn't need anyone to tell us what kind of movie it was. We felt it almost immediately. On paper, the story is simple. Two adults meet in New York. They begin a relationship that slowly shifts from romance into something more controlled, more obsessive, and less easy to define. There's no big mystery pulling us forward, no action beats, no outside threat. The entire film stays locked in on the space between these two people on attraction, power, and how intimacy changes when it's allowed to linger. And that's exactly why watching it felt so uncomfortable. Director Adrian Lyne wasn't interested in protecting the audience. He didn't rush moments along. He didn't soften desire with humor or distance. He held the camera just long enough to make us aware of ourselves watching. As viewers, we weren't invited to relax. We were invited to observe, quietly, closely, and without guidance. That's when the room started to matter. In the 80s, movies like this didn't belong to private screens. They showed up on VHS, on late night television, in shared living rooms. So we adjusted. We lowered the volume. We stayed closer to the screen. We listened for movement outside the room. Not because something extreme was happening, but because the film refused to give us a safe excuse for watching. There was no spectacle to hide behind. No genre label we could casually explain if someone walked in. Just prolonged intimacy that made us feel like witnesses to something personal. That's what made 9.5 Weeks a movie we watched alone. Not because it crossed a clear line, but because it erased the distance that usually protects the audience. And once we experienced a film like that, we understood something the 80s never said out loud. Some movies weren't meant to be illegal. They were just meant to be private. Number 6, Body Heat, 1981. When we came across a movie like this in the early 80s, it didn't feel like romance, and it definitely didn't feel safe. On the surface, it plays like a classic noir. A small-town lawyer, a married woman, a relationship that starts with attraction and quickly turns into something darker. But as the story unfolds, we realize this isn't really a crime film. It's a film about desire overriding judgment, about how quickly logic disappears once attraction takes control. Director Lawrence Kasdan places the audience uncomfortably close to that process. We're not watching desire from a distance, we're pulled into it step by step without the usual moral handrails. That's what made it hard to watch openly. This wasn't the kind of movie where intimacy was brief or decorative. It was heavy, sweaty, lingering in a way that made us aware of how long the camera stayed in the room. And in the 1980s, that mattered. Films like this didn't come with clear labels. They showed up on VHS shelves. They aired late on television. They entered shared spaces without warning. So we adapted. We didn't watch Body Heat casually. We didn't leave it playing if someone walked by. Because explaining why we were watching this kind of film was harder than just changing the channel. It wasn't explicit in a way that crossed an obvious line. It was erotic in a way that felt intentional, as if the film wanted us to sit with desire long enough to feel complicit in it. That's why Body Heat became a movie people watched quietly. Not because it was forbidden, but because it made us feel exposed for wanting to keep watching. And once we felt that, we understood something the decade never said directly. Some films weren't dangerous because of what they showed. They were dangerous because of how clearly they showed us. Number 5, Blue Velvet, 1986. When we watched a movie like this in the 80s, it didn't feel sexy in a comfortable way. It felt disturbing, and that was exactly the problem. On the surface, the story looks almost ordinary. A quiet town, a curious young man, something strange hiding beneath a clean, familiar surface. But very quickly, we realize this isn't a mystery meant to be solved, it's an experience meant to unsettle us. Director David Lynch doesn't guide the audience towards safety, he holds the camera steady, he lets scenes stretch longer than expected, he refuses to explain what we're supposed to feel, and that's where the discomfort begins. The intimacy in this film isn't romantic, it's invasive. Desire isn't framed as pleasure, but as something dangerous, obsessive, and unbalanced. As viewers, we're placed in an awkward position. We're not given distance, we're not allowed to look away without missing something important. In the 1980s, that kind of experience didn't belong in a shared room. This was the kind of movie we watched quietly, not because we were embarrassed by what was on screen, but because we couldn't explain why we were still watching. It wasn't explicit enough to dismiss, it wasn't safe enough to feel normal. And once a film makes desire feel unsettling instead of exciting, it changes the way you think about intimacy on screen. Which brings us to the next film on this list. One that pushed that discomfort even further, by stripping away romance entirely and replacing it with something colder, quieter, and impossible to watch without feeling exposed. Number 4. The Hunger, 1983. By the time we reached a film like this in 1983, the discomfort had shifted. It wasn't loud anymore, it wasn't aggressive. It was quiet, controlled, and much harder to explain. On the surface, The Hunger looks elegant, stylish characters, a refined world, a story built around immortality, attraction, and slow decay. There's a central relationship that feels less like romance and more like fascination, desire mixed with distance, intimacy without warmth. Director Tony Scott makes a very specific choice here. He doesn't rush anything, he doesn't clarify emotional boundaries, he lets atmosphere do the work. As viewers, we're drawn in by the look of the film first, the music, the pacing, the way bodies and faces are framed with restraint rather than urgency. And that restraint is what makes it so uncomfortable to watch openly. This isn't the kind of eroticism that feels impulsive or passionate. It's cold, distant, almost clinical, which means there's nowhere for us to hide. There's no humor to release the tension, no moral lesson guiding our response. Just prolonged intimacy presented as something quiet and inevitable. In the 1980s, that kind of film didn't fit easily into shared spaces. It was too slow to dismiss, too serious to laugh off, and too intimate to explain if someone walked in halfway through. So we watched it the same way we watched the others, late, quietly, with a growing awareness that the movie wasn't trying to entertain us, it was trying to hold us. And once eroticism stops asking for excitement and starts demanding attention, watching becomes a much more personal act. Which leads us to the next film on this list. One that took intimacy out of style and atmosphere altogether and placed it directly inside fear, guilt, and consequence. Number 3. Angel Heart, 1987. By the time we reached a film like this, intimacy no longer felt elegant or distant, it felt dangerous. On the surface, Angel Heart looks like a detective story, a private investigator, a missing person, a trail that leads deeper into unfamiliar territory. But very quickly, we realize this isn't really about solving anything, it's about descent. Director Alan Parker places desire right at the center of that descent, not as temptation, not as romance, but as something inseparable from guilt, fear, and loss of control. As viewers, we aren't positioned above the story, we're pulled into it, scene by scene, choice by choice. The intimacy in this film doesn't invite us in, it implicates us. Sex isn't presented as pleasure or release, it's tangled with dread, with consequences that feel inevitable the moment desire takes over. And that's what made this one especially hard to watch openly. There's no comfortable genre label to hide behind. It isn't clearly erotic, it isn't clearly horror, and it definitely isn't something you can explain halfway through. In the 80s, a film like this didn't belong on in the background. You had to give it attention, and once you did, you became aware of how exposed that attention felt. We didn't watch Angel Heart because it excited us. We watched it because it pulled us forward, even when we weren't sure we wanted to keep going. And when desire stops feeling alluring and starts feeling like a trap, watching becomes something private, almost confessional. Which brings us to the next film on this list. One that didn't mix intimacy with mystery or atmosphere, but turned it into a direct threat, and forced audiences to confront what happens when desire refuses to stay contained. Number 2. Fatal Attraction, 1987. By this point on the list, intimacy stops being abstract. It walks straight into everyday life. On the surface, Fatal Attraction looks familiar. A successful man, a brief affair, a mistake that's supposed to end quietly. That's what makes it unsettling so quickly. Director Adrian Lyne removes any safe distance between desire and consequence. There's no mystery layer to hide behind, no stylized atmosphere to soften what's happening. Everything feels close, domestic, uncomfortably normal. As viewers, we recognize the world immediately. Homes, families, routine. And then intimacy enters that space, not as romance, but as disruption. Sex in this film isn't framed as temptation or fantasy. It's framed as a choice that refuses to stay contained. A private act that spills outward and begins to threaten everything around it. That's why watching this movie felt different from the others. There was nothing symbolic to explain away, nothing abstract to hide behind. If someone walked in while this was playing, you couldn't say, "It's just a thriller," without knowing that wasn't the whole truth. This was a film that made desire feel dangerous, not because it was explicit, but because it was recognizable. In the 1980s, that recognition mattered. It meant this wasn't something we watched out of curiosity alone. We watched it with tension, with discomfort, with the awareness that the line between fiction and reality felt thinner than usual. And once a film places intimacy this close to ordinary life, watching it stops being thrilling in a safe way. It becomes something you'd rather experience quietly. Which brings us to the final film on this list, one that stripped everything down even further, removing genre, removing protection, and leaving the audience alone with nothing but desire and silence. Number 1. Dressed to Kill, 1980. By the time we reach the final film on this list, the idea of watching in secret is no longer symbolic, it's literal. On the surface, Dressed to Kill presents itself as a thriller, a psychiatrist, a patient, a crime that appears to anchor the story. But almost immediately, we understand this film is doing something else. Director Brian De Palma places the audience in a position that feels uncomfortably close. Not just close to the characters, but close to their gaze. We aren't simply watching desire unfold, we're watching it through someone else's eyes. That's the key difference. This film doesn't frame intimacy as mutual or private. It frames it as something observed, something followed, something that turns the act of looking into part of the experience. As viewers, we become aware of our own position. We're not outside the scene, we're implicated in it. And that made this movie especially difficult to watch openly. Not because of how explicit it was, but because of how clearly it understood the act of watching itself. In the 1980s, films like this didn't belong on in the background. They demanded attention, and that attention felt dangerous. You couldn't casually explain why you were watching it. You couldn't half watch and pretend nothing was happening. The film made you conscious of the fact that you were looking, and that awareness didn't feel innocent. This wasn't eroticism meant to be enjoyed comfortably. It was eroticism that made the audience self-aware, exposed. Which is why Dressed to Kill sits at the top of this list. Because out of all these films, this was the one that understood something most clearly. The real tension wasn't on screen, it was in the act of watching. And once a movie makes you feel that, watching stops being passive. It becomes something you do quietly, carefully, and very much alone. What these films really reveal isn't how bold the 80s were, but how unprepared that era was for intimacy on screen. They slipped through a system that hadn't decided where desire belonged, or who was supposed to deal with it. And maybe that's why they never really left. Not as clear stories, but as unfinished memories of a time when simply watching felt like a risk. If that tension still lingers for you, there's probably more than one film from that era you remember in fragments. Not scenes, not plots, just the feeling. If one of those memories surfaced while watching this, a like helps keep this space open, and the comments are there if you want to leave a trace of it, because these moments don't disappear.
They just wait for someone else to admit they remember them too.